I think, at least for me, we have a desire and a task, which is to try and understand Joseph Smith and his revelatory life and what that has to do with his statements about the artifacts that he was familiar with and that he had, and what that means for us. I think we understand fairly well the place of his canonized statements, the Book of Abraham, the Book of Mormon. I think we understand the place of those, but the question is the place of the non-canonized statements. What do we make of the things he says about these artifacts that he never sees through to publication? And that's the topic that I'll try to address today, and just acknowledging that this is a step towards a paradigm, something that I hope we can start to feel our way through, and that I just want to kind of roll the ball a little bit here, and then other people who are more able than I will hopefully do something very good with it. We ask ourselves, what do we know of Joseph Smith's interpretations? And as Dr. Gee has pointed out so well here, we know very little. We can look at the Times and Seasons accounts, what we now have in the Pearl of Great Price, and the interpretations of the facsimiles, and as Dr. Gee has pointed out, we don't even know if Joseph Smith is the author of these, although we know he was heavily involved in the publication and preparing the facsimiles and their explanations. He was at least heavily involved in that, whoever the original author was. That's really the extent of what we know, as Dr. Gee just said. Everything else we know that he said about the artifacts that he had are second and third hand accounts. And so it's to those second and third hand accounts that we must turn, knowing that they are second and third hand accounts. And we're going to only look at a few today because of lack of time, and we'll concentrate on those that tell us something about how he interpreted various drawings and his artifacts. We'll look at Sarah Leavitt, who visited in 1837, just a few years after they obtained the papyri. And we're only going to read part of these accounts, the parts that I haven't read. But she, after seeing the drawing, she's told that Jacob's ladder is pictured on the papyri. Now, we don't know who told her this. We don't know how far removed this would have been from Joseph Smith, but she at least tells us that Jacob's ladder was pictured there. A statement you don't know what to do with, but we always look for corroboration. Did other people say this same thing? That would lend some weight to what she said. We've heard several times already about the visit of Henry Caswell in 1842 with his mysterious book that he was trying to use to leverage to get people to show him things and to try and trick Joseph Smith. When he first wants to see the papyri, Joseph Smith is gone, as we've heard earlier. And so he's able to get someone who works at the store to show him the papyri and tell him a little bit about them. And as they tell him many things. One of those is they show him a drawing and say, well, those are the four quarters of the earth. And you see that big dog looking at the four figures. That is the old devil desiring to devour the four quarters of the earth. Look at this person keeping back the big dog. That is Jesus Christ, keeping the devil from devouring the four quarters of the earth. Then he goes on to point out some other figures, and he says, the figure on this side is Jacob, and those are his two wives. Now, do you see those steps? What? I replied. Do you mean those stripes across the dress of one of Jacob's wives? Yes, he said. That is Jacob's ladder. So now we have a confirming account. Someone at least has the idea. A few people have the idea, spanning a bit of a period of time, that Jacob's ladder is there, and we also have thrown in a depiction of the devil wanting to devour the four quarters of the earth. I suspect that they're referring to what we call Joseph Smith Papyrus 3. I think this is the one that was on display outside today, no? Okay, I lied about that. You have to watch out for me. I lie a lot. But in any case, I think that this is probably the one he's referring to, and you can see the dog here, and this would be the figure holding it back. What we have here is what I presume are Jacob and his three wives. The one on the side has now been cut off. There's not much of this figure left. And I suspect this little bit here is the ladder that they're referring to. Now, maybe they're referring to a drawing we don't have anymore, but this matches fairly well with the description, and I suspect that's what they're looking at. We'll come back to this drawing. It's a third-hand account. Let's be clear about that. This is Caswell hearing what a storekeeper heard Joseph Smith say. At the same time, and we won't read this, but he does record what this same storekeeper told him about another drawing, and it matches very well with what we understand about facsimile 1. And so his accuracy in this account, even though so much of Caswell's recordings is problematic. His accuracy in this account suggests that maybe there's something to that other account, especially because it corroborates the idea of Jacob's ladder being there. If we look at a few other accounts that record what people thought Joseph Smith said these various drawings he had meant, we can look at William I. Appleby, in this case a member of the church, who visited in 1841 but wrote about his visit years later. He speaks about seeing a serpent who beguiled Eve, and he appears with 2 legs, erect in form, and talks about this serpent having a forked tongue extended. In the drawings we have today, this is the only 2-legged serpent. That's not an uncommon drawing in Egyptian funerary papyri. This one does not have a forked tongue extended, and so I suspect this is not the snake that Appleby is speaking of. His account is corroborated by a young girl who visits Nauvoo and Charlotte Haven in 1843, and she writes letters that are later published. And among other things, she talks about when Mother Smith showed her the papyri and told her a number of things, but for our purposes, the interesting thing is that she saw Mother Eve being tempted by the serpent. The serpent, I mean, was standing on the tip of his tail, which with his 2 legs formed a tripod and had his head in Eve's ear. Again, that, third-hand account. But what's interesting to us is it's a tripod tail, or a tripod and whispering in the ear. And again, as we look at this, I don't think that she's describing this one. Those 2 accounts together make me think that they are being told that there's some kind of a legged serpent that represents the Garden of Eden story, and that it's not what we have now, and so it's difficult to evaluate these things. Now, we then ask ourselves a question that I'm not sure is the question we should ask, and we'll return to that later, but we ask ourselves the question, how do these interpretations square with an Egyptological perspective? And I want to start out by being very clear that while some of these accounts, the judgment scene, for instance, are one of the scenes that have been studied more by Egyptologists than most, the legged snake, which we often call the Sata snake, is less understood than most, but still, we come at these with a limited perspective as Egyptologists, and I'm convinced that most of what we're writing today, 20 years from now, we'll be writing different things. But even with that acknowledgement, let's look at how they would square with our current limited understanding from an Egyptological perspective. Most people would describe this as a judgment scene. They would say this is a devourer. I don't think they would say this is the Savior. And, all right. And I doubt very many people would say that this is Jacob or his wives, or that the sash here is the Jacob's ladder. Those don't square, at least with an Egyptological understanding. Now we'll talk about how to deal with that later. Very few people would say, even if this isn't the drawing, but if it was something similar, I think very few people would acknowledge that as the Garden of Eden scene. And so there's some dissonance there. Now, as we deal with this dissonance, we have to take into account some historical cautions. Again, we're reading second and third-hand accounts. Often there's a distance between when it happened and when they recorded the event. Those are cautions we need to be aware of. But again, there's some agreement between the accounts. I would suggest we not hasten to evaluate just this issue in isolation, because there are related issues that we should also look at, and I think we'll be better served if we look at them together. Some of the other issues are dealing with the purported identity of the mummies that Joseph Smith owns, and the handwriting on the papyri. So we'll look at only a few of the many statements we have on those things. One comes from Bartlett, printed in the Quincy Whig, who has a long statement. As part of it, he says that Joseph Smith told him that one of the mummies was one of the pharaohs who sat on the throne of Egypt, and that the daughter, the female there, was a daughter who may have been the princess, and this is Bartlett replying, it may have been the Princess Thermutis, I replied, the same that rescued Moses from the waters of the Nile. Everyone who had a mummy thought that maybe this was connected with the Exodus, not just the saints. And then Joseph Smith replies, time has not yet allowed me to fully examine and decide that point. So at this point, he says he's not sure exactly who the mummies are. But later accounts, again, second and third hand, seem to suggest that at some point they decide these are the folks associated with the Exodus. Bartlett continues by saying that Joseph Smith showed him the writings on the papyri and said, that is the signature of the patriarch Abraham. Not sure exactly what he means by that, but if he means the literal handwriting of Abraham, then that's an interesting thing. Some of this is corroborated by Josiah Quincy, whose record of his visits, again, are very problematic in a number of ways. He visits in 1844, but he agrees in saying that some of it was the handwriting of Abraham, and this is a statement we get enough times that I think there's something to it. He also talks about seeing the autograph of Moses and lines that were written by Aaron. I only find that in Josiah Quincy's account, and it's written late enough, and there are a number of problems with it. I'm not sure we should give a lot of credence to that, but there's corroboration for the handwriting of Abraham, and that should be taken into account. We also need to be aware that most of the accounts we have come to us third hand from people who hear Lucy Mack Smith talking about the papyri. The reason for this is that while Joseph Smith is in Liberty Jail, she starts showing the papyri, and from there until the end of her life, she was the one who, for the most part, was in charge of the mummies and papyri and supported herself by showing these. Even when Joseph Smith was in the house, it was his mother who would show them to people and explain them. So most of our accounts come third hand through Lucy Mack Smith, and we only hear extraneously what Joseph Smith may have thought of it. That being said, it's worth looking at just one that is representative of many others. Joseph Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, told me that the mummy was King Onidas, and supposed that this was the Pharaoh of the Exodus himself and his wife and his daughters. And when he wondered how she knew that, she said, "My son Joseph recently received a revelation from the Lord regarding these people and their times. He told it all to me." We're only going to read this one statement, but there are a number of people who hear from Lucy Mack Smith that these are royal mummies, and on occasion that it's the handwriting of Abraham. And so whether we can correctly attribute that to Joseph Smith or not, we have a great deal of evidence that Lucy Mack Smith at least was saying that. Again, what are we to do? There are some problems, at least Egyptologically, from these things. You can never prove that these mummies were not royal, but it seems highly unlikely that these were royal mummies for a number of reasons. We can't be sure that the papyri they're looking at are the fragments that we have now, but the fragments we have now are probably from about 200 BC, roughly, and the Abraham's about 2000 BC, so it's unlikely that that's Abraham's actual handwriting. And so we ask ourselves, what should we do with statements like this? And it's that issue that I'd like to spend a little time on. How do we deal with this dissonance? And I'd like to suggest a few possible paradigms that can be people from different perspectives might take to deal with these things. Paradigm one, which is the paradigm that I think most of those who are not believers in Joseph Smith would take, is the paradigm of no inspiration. And that would be that Joseph Smith is just a product of his times. Everyone was interested in ancient things. Joseph Smith made up all sorts of stuff like many of his contemporaries did, and that none of what he said was correct. It was completely made up. This would apply to his canonized statements as well as the non-canonized statements. This fails to account for some of the accuracies in the text, like the interesting one we've just heard from John Gee and other things that we've dealt with, and accuracies in other interpretations. I think it also fails to account for the real and valid revelatory experiences of millions of people like myself, and I think this is something we should be more bold and adamant about, that revelatory experiences are valid and need to be dealt with. They can't be lightly dismissed. In any case, this is a paradigm we're not going to spend a lot of time on. It's fairly simple and will be held by the majority, not a paradigm I particularly hold to. Let's look at paradigm two. This is the paradigm of complete inspiration. Under this paradigm, we'd suggest that everything Joseph Smith said about the ancient world was correct, that he was always inspired, and that any dissonance, any disagreement between what modern academia would say and what Joseph Smith said is our fault. It's the fault of one of two things. It's either the fault of our ideas and abilities, and that as we progress as a discipline, that we'll come to agree with Joseph Smith more and more, and eventually in time, all of this will validate Joseph Smith. Or perhaps that sometimes that dissonance is the fault of our assumptions. Some of these assumptions Dr. Gies just talked about. Let me highlight a few more that we should look at. For example, assumptions are made about the redaction of the text of the book of Abraham. One can assume that Abraham either dictated or wrote that text, and we either have that actual piece of papyrus or a copy of a copy of a copy, but one that remained unchanged, and that then the text we have is exactly the way Abraham wrote it. That is possible. In this case, then, anything that might be taken as an anachronism. For example, many people take the word used in their Chaldees to be out of its time period in Abraham's day, that any anachronisms are, again, our fault, our lack of understanding how these terms were really used. However, it would be rather singular in the history of canonized texts, both ancient and modern, for there to be no redaction and no changes to be made in the text. Dr. Gee just showed us one that happened in Joseph Smith's lifetime. It would be rather singular. If we are to presume that this went through a redactional history somewhat similar to the Bible, or even the Book of Mormon, then we would say that there might be some things in the text that are the results of people adding it later, and in this way, any anachronisms would be similar to that are present in Genesis and would have similar explanations. Other assumptions would have to be with interpreting the vignettes or the drawings that we call facsimiles. And we often assume that we should look at how the ancient Egyptians would have interpreted these drawings. Perhaps that is what we should do. Maybe Joseph Smith is telling us that that's how ancient Egyptians would have interpreted the drawings. But other questions should be brought up. One that was brought up by Kevin Barney in an excellent article. Maybe we should be looking at how Semites in the day that the manuscript we have was created, how would Jews from that day have interpreted that text? Maybe we should be looking at a subset of Egyptians. There were Egyptians from that time period who were aware of Moses and Abraham and were using them in their Egyptian religious texts, and Jehovah and other biblical figures. Maybe Joseph is just giving us the interpretation that a small group of Egyptians would have given these. It's also possible that Joseph Smith is telling us that this is what we should learn from it, regardless of how any ancient person at all would have seen this. This is what you and I should learn from it in our day or in his day. These are assumptions that we have to look at, and if we've made the wrong assumption, that may be the reason why we see some of this dissonance that we're talking about. Let's talk about paradigm 3, another paradigm that I think is possible for believers, and that is the paradigm of partial inspiration. Under this paradigm, we would say that Joseph Smith is inspired in all matters that relate to doctrine, that relate to things that we need to know and understand and that come to us through the canon and other official channels, but that he may be left on his own in regards to everything else, that the Lord may not instruct him about every ancient artifact he ever saw. There are a couple of underlying, I guess, ideas that this paradigm would be based on, and one of those is that we do not have a doctrine of infallibility, that we do not believe that prophets are always correct. We don't have the time to read all of these. Let me just read Joseph Smith himself, who said, "A prophet is a prophet only when he is acting as such." And we could have a slew of statements from prophets about this. We don't have a doctrine of infallibility, and so with that, we could make, or we could use this paradigm. We would then have to ask ourselves questions. Would God need to correct Joseph's ideas about handwriting? If Joseph assumes that the papyri he has, since he knows it has the writing of Abraham on it, if he assumes that Abraham himself wrote it, would God feel the need to correct him in that? Or would he need to correct assumptions that he may have made about legged snakes? Would he have to correct assumptions he made about who these mummies were? If he is somewhat a product of his time in those days, would God feel the need to say, "Oh, you're wrong about that, Joseph"? I don't know. Does Joseph sometimes struggle with discerning inspiration as we do, is another question we have to ask. We've talked so much about his reliance on the Holy Ghost and the wonderful revelatory life he had, and I think that's absolutely true and important. But I wonder if he doesn't struggle a little bit the way we often do. My experience with Latter-day Saints, and certainly my own personal experience, is that one of the things we struggle with the most is discerning between our own thoughts and inspirations that come from God, especially as we seek answers to prayers and life experiences. Sometimes it takes us a little while to learn what are we receiving that is from God and what is it that are our own ideas. And I wonder if, with so much revelation coming to Joseph Smith so frequently, if this wasn't even more of a struggle for him than for us. If it didn't happen for him so often, if it's not possible that he would assume all of his thoughts were revelation, and it might take him a little time to work through this. Now, that's a little bit of a tricky question. How do we then know when it is inspiration and when it is not? And I don't pretend to be the person who can answer that question or who would be able to answer that question, but I think Joseph Smith himself gives us a suggestion, and he does this in section 128 when he writes to the saints, and he says, "I now resume the subject of the baptism for the dead, as that subject seems to occupy my mind and press itself upon my feelings the strongest. Is it possible that as thoughts came to Joseph Smith, he knew that this was inspiration because it came to him repeatedly, again and again, and that he then saw those projects through to publication, or at least attempts at publication, that he consistently came back to them and worked on them because the Spirit kept working on him and moving him towards working on those things? I think that's something that we need to explore. And as I said, these are just the first steps in what I hope will be an important dialogue about this. But this may guide us a little bit as we try to understand, perhaps as Joseph Smith looks at mummies, he has some ideas about them and says something, but isn't moved upon by the Spirit to continue working on that and publishing that, because it's perhaps just his own ideas. I don't know. It's a possibility. Now, paradigm 3 has the same assumptions that paradigm 2 had that we have to deal with. And so we have to be aware of these same assumptions. It contains all those same issues that we have to think our way through. If we examine paradigms 2 and 3 together, they will seem too convenient to the non-believer. It's awfully easy to explain things away with either of these paradigms, although I think they're based on good principles. It's also impossible to prove or disprove using the academic method these paradigms, although that's not surprising to me. It can account for both accuracies, such as the one Dr. Gee just showed us, and for some inaccuracies. And it can account for the revelatory experiences that myself and millions of others have had, that Joseph Smith was inspired in matters such as the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon, that he was an inspired prophet that really received revelation from God. None of the paradigms I've suggested can actually account for all of the data or evidence that we have, and I've not seen a paradigm or a theory that yet can. That's why it's important that we keep thinking about these issues and keep collaborating and working towards it, because I don't think that we can yet account for all the data, and that's not surprising to me, because when we're dealing with the things of God, I don't expect that we'll figure this out very quickly. And again, I think Joseph's revelatory life is beyond my ability to understand. As I said, I hope this is just a step towards a dialogue about how to evaluate these ideas. I think we need to be able to dialogue with people from all perspectives in a respectful manner, those who would hold to any of these 3 paradigms. And I hope that as we do so, that we can continue to deal with Joseph's amazing flow of revelations. And would like to end on that note that, as we've heard from a number of other people, what Joseph relied on was less the old book and more the Holy Ghost. And that those revelatory experiences were real and powerful for Joseph. And that was the source of his ability to translate and give us what we have as canonized texts, such as the Book of Abraham or the Book of Mormon. Thank you.